Men and women, do you know what happened to Nottingham Castle? There was a great agitation for the Reform Bill, which was blocked by the House of Lords, so the men who wanted votes burnt down Nottingham Castle, the seat of the Duke of Newcastle, to the ground. They also burnt Colwick Castle, the neighboring seat of another anti-suffragist, and his wife died from illness caused by the shock. In Bristol, in a single night, private as well as public property was destroyed to the value of over £100,000.
This was the type of action being taken towards women's suffrage in the United Kingdom in 1832, when women were excluded from voting by the Great Reform Act. Despite the shocking events at Nottingham Castle, it took another 86 years to get the government to recognize women's right to vote. According to UK Parliament, previous to this 1832 exclusion, the instances where women voted were occasional, although rare. Immediately after they were barred from voting with this act, the first petition for women's suffrage was presented to Parliament, and thus began the United Kingdom's fight for women's suffrage.
As initial protests began, the movement started to organize itself. Women activists divided themselves into two groups, the suffragists and the suffragettes. The suffragists were focused more on passive action, while the suffragettes utilized militancy. As shown by the aggressive methods like the events of Nottingham Castle, the suffragettes clearly wanted change and were not afraid to fight for it. However, this violence often discredited the movement and led to the enforcement of negative stereotypes against women and both parties.
The movement was gaining more traction because of the rising suffrage movement, but all of that stopped when a great tragedy started. On August 4th, 1914, Great Britain declared war on Germany and entered World War I. The war focused most of the country's efforts on supporting the troops, and even major women's rights leaders put their fight for suffrage behind the scenes to help with war work.
Yes, so first of all, there's no doubt at all, of course, that women played a huge role in the war efforts in the UK in the First World War. Something like 1 million extra women entered the workforce during the course of the war, not all at once and not all at the beginning, of course.
Large numbers of men became soldiers and left the country to fight, leaving behind their important manufacturing and farming jobs. This led to a need for replacement employees, and women were up to the task. They became police officers, coal heavers, worked in munition factories, and a whole new range of jobs that hadn't usually been available. The move to war work was strategic for many suffragettes, and they knew that working could help prove their capability as equals to men.
But I think one thing it is safe to say is that even though suffrage campaigning took a back seat, it wasn't as obvious as it was before the war. None of the suffrage leaders ever lost sight of it. So Emmeline and Christabel weren't going to prioritise it while the war was going on. They thought it was important to support the war effort, but that doesn't mean they weren't sort of behind the scenes, taking the attitude very much that if women helped the war effort, they would be more likely to get the vote at the end of it.
When violent protests went down and productivity went up, Parliament finally started to see women as people. The work women did during the war was key in revitalizing the fight, and it helped finally change the mindset of the government.
In order to address women's rights, the politicians included clauses that gave women suffrage in the Fourth Reform Act. The Fourth Reform Act only gave the right to vote to women over 30 who met property qualifications, and these requirements didn't represent the majority of the women who had been working. This was a strategic move by Parliament that aimed to maintain a male majority of voters. There were many casualties in the war, and there was a larger population of women at the time. Although only some women were given suffrage as a result of this act, it was a huge step in the right direction and finally opened the doors to all sorts of equal rights activism.
The invaluable contribution of women during the First World War was responsible for the long-term and far-reaching impact of the Fourth Reform Act of 1918, which gave women the right of suffrage that led to the first female member of Parliament and would eventually move towards a more inclusive government.
The Fourth Reform Act gave suffrage to 8.5 million women, which greatly increased the voting pool for the next election. Women's suffrage had been the main goal pre-war, and now the women's rights movement could go in all sorts of directions beyond just voting.
This, of course, is why women wanted the vote in the first place. It had become a bit of a single issue before the First World War, but it could become multiple issues there.
One goal of the Broad-End movement was to get women further integrated in the government. A year after the act was passed, Nancy Astor was elected to replace her husband, Waldorf Astor, becoming the first woman to take a seat in Parliament.
This is not a popular cause to have in the House of Commons, but but she managed to get a private members bill passed, which is no mean achievement for an MP, which restricted the sale of drink to people under 18, and that is still in our law today in the UK. But Asta is always there, promoting any cause that affected women's lives, gender equality, children, including equal franchise, and willing to vote against her party if necessary.
As more and more women began to enter the political scene, favorable politicians were forced to give in to demands for equality. The mindset of the government was changing, and it all started with women's suffrage.
Just over 1 year later, the Sex Disqualification Act was passed. It restricted employers from excluding women from jobs because of their gender, which increased the amount of women in the workplace even after the men returned home from war.
One of the most impactful follow-ups to the Fourth Reform Act was the Equal Franchise Act of 1928. It again expanded the voting pool, allowing women over 21 to vote and removing the property requirement. This raised the number of eligible women voters from 8 million to 15 million, finally putting women's votes on the same level as men's.
These acts and bills inherently proved the influence of the Fourth Reform Act passed years prior, because they themselves were prompted by women gaining suffrage. In the years before the Fourth Reform Act, influential bills in Parliament for women's rights were rejected and smothered. But after the Fourth Reform Act was passed, a new wave of governmental recognition helped get things done for the women's rights movement. These acts and bills couldn't have passed without the clauses spurred by the work women did in the First World War, and they gave women the vote they needed to influence politics and make acts like these possible.
The women's rights movement expanded over the next 50 years, exponentially increasing its own influence as more acts passed and women voted with the movement. In 1970, the Equal Pay Act was passed, legally requiring equal salaries between women and men, another big step that the first women activists had dreamed about for years.
Then, in 1979, Margaret Thatcher, aka the Iron Lady, became the first female Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. She quickly surpassed her predecessors and was re-elected because of her strong will, winning twice more. This would prove that women were not only capable of doing such important jobs, but also that they could surpass their male counterparts in their success.
The courage and hard work of the women during the First World War allowed for the first step in the grand race towards equality for women. From their initial right to vote and throughout the century that followed, women have worked to continually move towards equal rights. Devoted women changed the mindset of the government, which led to the Fourth Reform Act that opened the door to fight for other equalities and rights. The Act's influence is demonstrated still today through the acts continually passed for women's rights, because they're only possible with a voting base to support them.
It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know.